the U.S.-Mexico border, I think so much of the mentality that you see in the media about it is, yeah, this is a thing that Texas and Arizona and to a lesser extent California have to deal with. But obviously there are a few other states along the border that you could throw in there, but it actually affects New York City very directly. The greatest concentration of illegal immigrants in the United States is New York City. And what's interesting is that when Eric Adams made this visit down to the border, some of the migrants were saying to him, oh, well, you're like the best for taking in illegal migrants. I don't mean the best as in like the best guy, or maybe, but New York gives the best benefits. New York is a place that has been so welcoming in this sense. And Eric Adams, meanwhile, just to give everybody a sense of this, is saying there is no more room for migrants. This needs to stop. His city cannot handle this. We have a few things that tie together here. Mr. Clay, I want to just walk us through this for a moment. This is interesting because one of our ongoing questions here is, what is really the end game of all this Biden document stuff, right? And I don't want to dive into that back and forth right now, but we've been talking about it in the first hour, because something doesn't add up here. Is it just sloppiness from Biden and or is it the system pushing Biden aside? There's a lot of things here that we still are trying to figure out. But one part of this is who would take over, right? Who would be in the mix, in the running? We've talked about Kamala Harris, obviously, because she's the vice president, the most obvious. Although in the poll that I put out on Twitter, thousands and thousands of responses, solid 60+% think that if Biden goes, it's in favor of Gavin Newsom, which is interesting. That is then likely to be a floor. I could say this, I think, with a high level of confidence, that the 2024 election, should Gavin Newsom be the Democrat nominee, would be a California versus Florida throwdown in some capacity. Florida will be in there.
It's what
one
we
way or
should
another,
have, Buck, right? Like, ultimately, those are the two sides of our great national debate over the past several years.
I agree. I mean, I actually was somebody who I wanted Bernie Sanders to be the Democrat nominee in the past, because I think that what you get with Bernie Sanders is more of a distillation of liberalism for Democrats today, without the veneer of just the sort of corporate interests and the self-dealing at the same level, which is what you get with, say, a Hillary Clinton. So I think if you want to have a real throwdown of belief systems and governing systems, notice how I say Florida. And I think a lot of you would agree, it's going to be Florida represented in some capacity on the GOP side. That I think you'd get 10-1 odds in favor of right now, whether it's Trump or DeSantis. But it's going to be one of them, and you can have your pick as to which one you think it'll be. California, though, with Newsom is interesting. I bring it up, though, because very interesting. You might have seen this, Clay. Over the weekend, you had the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, went down to El Paso, Texas. Now, as somebody who has made the journey from New York to El Paso in the past, it's not a quick flight, not an easy one to do. So there was a reason for this. And I think a lot of people are starting to see this as a possible. And I want to ask you if you think that this is a moment where Adams is trying to step out into on the national stage at a moment of weakness for Biden. Are these things all tied together? And then I want to dive in with you to what the actual border realities are and how it affects New York. But first, is Eric Adams testing the waters a little bit here?
It's such a good question, and I'm pausing for a moment because I don't know that Eric Adams has the political cachet to be making a strong strategic play like this intentionally. Does that make sense? Like, I believe that there are politicians like Gavin Newsom showing up at the White House and rolling up his sleeves when Joe
he was
Biden
he's like, I've got plenty of headroom in this office. This is great.
When you visit the White House when Joe Biden isn't there, it is among the most disrespectful things that I have ever seen a politician do, right? And then you meet the media and everything else. Like, that was not by accident. That was Gavin Newsom being a cold, calculating.
He was measuring the drapes. Yes.
I feel like Eric Adams is a guy who, on some level, recognizes that Democrats have gone insane. Like, I feel like this, Buck. If you, me, and Eric Adams sat down at a table in New York City, probably late at night, because he seems to be like to get out late at night and
he
have
likes
a little
to
bit
party.
of fun.
It is a true thing. Yes.
But if we sat down at a table with him, I feel like we'd probably like him, right? Because I think he would say many things that we would agree with. You got to get the crime down in New York City. This idea of all of these immigrants coming into the city of New York that he clearly loves is unacceptable. So I think he's diagnosing that there are problems. I'm not sure that he's diagnosing that there are problems and putting forth solutions. Does that make sense? So in terms of whether it's calculated, going to El Paso to recognize that there is an issue there is a calculated decision. Is it calculated in the sense of, I have a solution to this? I don't know. I would love it if he challenged Joe Biden, because I do think that would be fascinating to see how the political aspects of it would play out. I'm not sure that he's planning it, if that makes sense.
So a few things that I think come into this. So that's on the political side. Then back to the border component of this, which is still a huge story that is, and I think this is a reminder for everybody that the U.S.-Mexico border, I think so much of the mentality that you see in the media about it is, yeah, this is a thing that Texas and Arizona and to a lesser extent California have to deal with. But obviously there are a few other states along the border that you could throw in there, but it actually affects New York City very directly. The greatest concentration of illegal immigrants in the United States is New York City. And what's interesting is that when Eric Adams made this visit down to the border, some of the migrants were saying to him, oh, well, you're like the best for taking in illegal migrants. I don't mean the best as in like the best guy, or maybe, but New York gives the best benefits. New York is a place that has been so welcoming in this sense. And Eric Adams, meanwhile, just to give everybody a sense of this, is saying there is no more room for migrants. This needs to stop. His city cannot handle this. Now, this is fascinating. And I think in part, Clay, to your point about how he does have a streak of the sensible for a Democrat. He does have some aspects of policy that I think are veering toward common sense. He has not been a good mayor so far of New York, but he hasn't been actively destroying the city, which is, I think, what Bill de Blasio did. Bill de Blasio was like, sorry, if we have to ruin this place, as long as there's more social justice and I feel good about myself when I'm smoking lots of weed. By the way, that's de Blasio. Well known to be a big weed smoker. There's a true story, actually. There were guys, I knew people that knew people on his detail, and de Blasio was a fan of smoking the weed. Anyway, I think that Adams recognizes that when you see there's more money, and this goes right to the heart of the illegal immigration issue, there is more money going to house illegal migrants right now than money that is going toward New Yorkers that lack shelter altogether. So effectively, they're starting to spend more money on the people who aren't even supposed to be in the country in the first place. This is beginning to happen than the people who are having a really hard time, who are New Yorkers of all backgrounds. But yes, in New York, disproportionately, for talking about people who lack housing, they're black and Hispanic New Yorkers. So people are looking at this and saying, what are the priorities here?
Well, Buck, I'm still kind of caught up on the politics of it. And I think you might be hitting something that's really fascinating. If everybody else is clearing the deck for Joe Biden, and they're basically saying Biden's going to be the guy, we're not challenging him, what if Eric Adams was the only Democrat to run against him? And how would Eric Adams play? They're trying to redo the calendar. How would Eric Adams play in South Carolina? you got a black guy that would connect, I think, with a lot of black South Carolinians in many of the things that he would be saying, versus James Clyburn, who is a very popular and powerful black politician who many of you will remember basically said, Joe Biden is my guy, and that got Joe Biden the nomination and then the presidency. And if I'm sitting back and looking at this in a calculated fashion, and again, I don't know who advises Eric Adams and what his team would look like, but if everybody else is clear in the deck and Eric Adams recognizes that Joe Biden has some common sense vulnerabilities, that he is a black former police captain who is now the mayor of the biggest city in the United States, and Buck, I would say, the murder rate went down in New York City in 2022. So if you're Eric Adams and you're trying to think of a big, strong argument that you could make, you could say, hey, I became mayor of New York and we reversed the murder rate climb. Now, it's still far too high and it's up massively since 2019. But you know what? I'm starting to see the political calculus that could be running through his head. And look, you don't win necessarily. But if you challenge Joe Biden and make yourself a major national figure, can you beat Kamala Harris in 28? I think he's probably better than Kamala in 28. And I love this idea now, Buck.
Bill de Blasio claims, just because I'm kind of fixated on this for a second, that he has not smoked weed since college. I do not believe him. Okay, that's because there are people asking him all the time because there have been rumors about this, and I've heard from people who have heard from people that if you spend enough time around the guy, I don't know. But he claims, to set the record straight, that does not happen. But I have heard from people.
I would think I'm actually
does
surprised that he would deny it, just because would it hurt him in Democrat politics in New York City if he admitted that he liked to smoke weed?
It's interesting. Well, because he wasn't as full on for legalization as I think some people anticipated that he would be. But anyway, just to set the record straight, he says that he didn't, even though I've heard from people who would know that he does. Anyway, but who knows? I wasn't there. As for Eric Adams and his presidential aspirations, if they exist, I think that's going to be a case where it will all come down to the record in New York City in a lot of ways.
Isn't it? Sorry to cut you, but isn't it? You lived in New York City for a long time. Isn't it also incredibly elevating if he were the only guy to run against Biden? I mean, it doesn't seem like he's a part of the cool kids club where everybody would be like, oh, in D.C., this is Joe Biden's time. Don't step on his toes. Seems like he might be willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's an interesting choice if you're going to see some kind of an open primary situation where you have a lot of different candidates who are at least vying behind closed doors to take over from Biden. I think you'd have to have, if you're not going to have Kamala as just the person stepping in, and I think you would, but if you're going to have an open primary and not just a coronation for Kamala, you could well have Eric Adams get involved. But I also, on just the immigration side of this again for a second, that he goes down there because right now the House Republicans are considering a vote of impeachment against Mayorkas, and I get it, and I'm all for holding these individuals accountable, but you're going to impeach somebody who's going to get replaced if even he was removed, which is not going to happen. But if he were removed from office, you get replaced with somebody who does the bidding of the machine just the same way. It doesn't really, as long as Joe Biden gets to appoint the head of DHS. Now you could say, well, he lied or he's been particularly bad. Okay, but the policy doesn't change if Mayorkas goes. And I just think it's interesting that Eric Adams, because he has to look at city budgets and the reality of New York, which I think has a huge budget train coming down the tracks. They got problems with where this budget is heading, as a lot of people have fled New York City in particular. There's a huge you are seeing one of the big debates about illegal immigration has been, does this cost taxpayers a lot of additional money? Is there a drain on resources that you will feel in your city or in your state from illegal immigration? The answer must be yes, because the Democrat mayor of New York City is saying no more room for migrants. We can't afford them.
It's not only that, Buck. It's the conjunction of too many migrants with all of the high taxpayers of New York City fleeing because Kathy Hochul said, why don't you guys just all move to Florida? So it's a combination of rising expenses, declining revenue, which, as anybody who does basic business knows, ain't a position that you want to be in.